Rappin with ReefBum is sponsored by Marine Depot.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Rappin with ReefBum. I am your host, Keith Berkelhamer, and today I have the pleasure, I've got a very special guest here with us, Charles Delbeek. And hey Charles, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, Keith. How are you doing?
I am doing fantastic, and it is a true honor to have a reef-keeping legend such as yourself on the show tonight. And you know, for those of you that don't know, Charles is an author, and he was also, and is currently the curator. Let me get into this before I get into the good stuff about the reef keeping stuff. So he's currently the curator at the Steinhart Aquarium in San Francisco, California. And as I mentioned, he's a pioneer in the reef keeping hobby. This is a thrill for me. But many of you probably know Charles for the revolutionary series of books that he co-authored with Julian Sprung called the Reef Aquarium. And there were 3 volumes. This is volume 3. I couldn't dig up the other 2 volumes. I know they're somewhere in the house, and I have to go and find these. Oh, I think Charles has got them.
Hello.
You got volumes.
Yeah.
You got volumes 1 and 2.
Yeah, I do. I got them in English and German and French.
There you go. That's volume 2, right?
That's volume 1.
Volume 1.
That's volume 2.
Sweet. So yeah, if anybody doesn't have those 3 books, I highly recommend that you pick them up, because they, like I mentioned, these things are Bibles. They really are.
Hard to find now.
Are they?
Yeah, they're all out of print. Just volume 3 is available as an ebook on iBooks. Wow. Yeah.
So another interesting fact: Charles was also the driving force behind behind organizing the first ever MACNA in 1989, which was held in Toronto, which is where he lived. Charles was also an aquatic biologist at the Waikiki Aquarium. That sounded like one heck of a job. And Charles, listen, I just really appreciate you taking the time to be with us and to to chat with us. This is awesome.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Keith, and that's quite a generous introduction. I don't know if I could live up to that one. Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah, no.
And so it's really it's an honor to be here, and this is not a forum, a media stream that I normally get involved with, like YouTube and online stuff. It's I'm still kind of old school that way, I guess. But yeah, this is exciting.
Well, I know folks are really excited to have you on, and as always, for the people that are tuning in here, just encourage you to ask Charles questions in the chat. And I see a bunch of familiar faces tuning in again tonight for the episode here. Before we start chatting with Charles, I just want to thank the show's sponsor, Marine Depot. I really appreciate their support, being a supporter of the show. And I mentioned the viewers. Hey, without the folks tuning in, there wouldn't be a show. So I really appreciate that. And spread the word about the show. Hit that like button so more people will find us tonight. But now that we've taken care of some of this business, Charles, let's kind of dig into some stuff here. What's your background, Charles, in terms of reef keeping? How did you kind of get into this whole hobby?
Oh, well, it's a very long story. I'll try to give you the Cole's Notes version here. Basically, I started in the hobby, well, basically keeping aquariums, and my dad started. He was really into fish tanks, and he had a small tank in the house. It was a freshwater tank, and that's how I got my first introduction to fishes. And then when I was about maybe 10 or 11, I started keeping a brackish water tank. We had scats and monos, and then we gradually changed that into salt. And then I started going down the Florida Keys in the summer with my parents for about 5 or 6 days, and then we went up to St. Pete after that. And I started snorkeling on the shoreline, and then snorkeling on the reefs when I was 13. Got certified when I was 14. I had a saltwater tank, I think, when I was about 12. I used to collect fish down the Keys by hand and bring them back in the car 3 days with an air bubbler and put them in my tank at home. And then I, in the 70s or so, it kind of slowed down. I was in high school, I had other interests, things like that. And then back in the mid 80s, I started getting back into to marine aquarium. And then I met George Schmidt in 1986, who was the author of a 8-part series in Freshwater Marine Aquarium magazine talking about this trickle filter and living reef tanks in Holland. And so he came up to Toronto and spoke to our aquarium society. He was actually the first speaker at our first inaugural meeting that we had, and we had 120 people there.
Wow.
And that just started off in reef tanks. And then we, about a year and a half later, we had John Burleson from Burleson, JP Burleson Incorporated up. He was a manufacturer of trickle filters. And we wanted to come up with a second year after that. And he said, well, I don't really have time, but I got this new young kid working for me that I think would be good. And I said, okay, well, we'll have him come up. And it turned out to be Julian Sprung. And so I met Julian, and I volunteered to host him at my place. And we became fast friends, and just kind of went onwards from there.
Wow. Yeah. So, folks, let me let's kind of like lay out the I guess kind of the plan of attack tonight with Charles. So Charles, you've obviously you're the curator at the Steinhart Aquarium, and you were also a biologist at the Waikiki Aquarium. So certainly want to dig into kind of your experience working on the public aquarium side, and you also have a presentation about the Steinhart Aquarium that you'll take us through. And I guess it's an abbreviated version of that presentation, perhaps. But so then once we get through that, we'll kind of dig into the reef keeping, on the hobby side. And I can already kind of see some questions popping up in the chat for you. So we hopefully will have time for all these different questions. But Charles, talk to us about what it's like to tend to or manage, let's say, aquarium on the public aquarium side versus on the hobby side. I mean, they're so much larger.
They are, but and some of them are actually smaller. So we have a wide range of habitats that we maintain at Steinhardt, anywhere from 5 gallons up to the big reef tank, which is 212,000 gallons. So it all comes down to the same basics, which is basically lighting, water motion, and water chemistry, trying to maintain those. And so in a bigger system, in a way, we've always been taught that the bigger the volume you have, the more stable it is. And that's true to a certain extent. The problem is that any changes you want to make, either good or bad, they happen slowly. And we kind of always use the analogy, it's like steering an oil tanker.
Oh, there you go.
Small little tweaks in something can make a huge difference in the course that this thing takes. but it takes a long time for you to see it. And then to make those corrective changes to bring it back on course, then take longer as well. But it's keeping the windows clean, and making the animals healthy. It's all this pretty much the same stuff. It's just I think what sets apart the public aquarium people is that, yes, it's a full-time job and we have people here every day, all day long working on the tanks, but they have more than one. They have more than two, they have more than four. They could have up to 15 to 20 tanks that they're looking after. So in a way, it's more challenging because you're having to split your time amongst these various habitats. And a lot of them, some are, some of my biologists have non-photosynthetic organisms, and they also have tanks with photosynthetic organisms. And some of them are looking after sygnathids and corals, or cephalopods in a coral tank, or they have freshwater tanks and saltwater tanks. So it's quite a range of things that they need to look after. And then on top of all that, they have all the departmental duties that they need to do and meetings to attend. And the big tanks that we have at Steinhardt, we have what we call our iconic exhibits. And those are managed by teams of biologists. So everybody's on at least two teams. So in addition to their normal tanks and duties, they also have these two large exhibits that they're also a team member of. So it's a lot of taxing stuff. So sometimes it's challenging to keep it at the level of quality that we want. Well, that's something that was instilled in me when I started working for Bruce Carlson and Ken Yates and Jerry Crow and various other supervisors that I had. Was, people are paying money to come and see this stuff, right? So that's a big difference between a hobby tank and your home tank and the public aquarium tank, is that people are paying money to see your tank. Right. So it's got to be up to snuff. So the big emphasis is before opening to get everything clean and ready. No spots on the window, no spots on the backdrops. Lights are on, everything's working, everything's humming along before people come in and spend money.
How do you manage a situation where something goes wrong with a tank and you've got an algae outbreak or something where it's just not looking at its best? How do you manage that with the public?
Well, you do the best you can in terms of troubleshooting what's going on, and normally it's something that sneaks up on you, right? I mean, it's not something that's the next day, and those kinds of things that happen quickly are like when pumps go out or filters go out, power's out, those kinds of things that happen, or the pump got left off and there was no water circulation, or a valve was closed, or a valve was opened and the tank got drained, or all these things have happened over the 20 some years that I've been in this industry. So, but basically it's troubleshooting. There's a chain of command. Who do you notify? Who do you call first? And then getting the more eyes on it, the better. I mean, you have lots of people there, lots of experience. So let's draw on that and let's all noodle it together and see if we can figure out what's going on.
So Steinhardt is in San Francisco. You guys have earthquakes out there. How do you manage through some of those tremors with those kind of tanks? I mean, are they kind of built to stand up to that sort of thing?
They are. The two biggest exhibits. So we have actually three pretty large exhibits. We have the big reef, of course, but we also have a cold water California coast exhibit that's 90,000 gallons and a 110,000 gallon Amazon exhibit. And the way that they built the building was that they're sort of like on a cantilever. They're opposite ends of the building. So the idea is that they're supposed to balance each other out. We haven't, knock on wood, we haven't had a major earthquake since I've lived here. You've had lots of small ones. We have everything's on emergency power. We have generators, that are fueled up and ready to go. So we can go several days without power. So we can withstand that kind of an outage. And we've had to rely on that several times, and they get tested all the time. We have earthquake drills. We have all kinds of safety drills. So there's lots of different things that, that we prepare for that. But, thankfully we haven't had to deal with something large like that. But, a lot of the exhibits are bolted to the ground. They're bolted to stands. The stands are bolted to the wall. So there's netting up over storage rooms, so there's things that can fall down or are secured in place. We don't let the biologists or anybody, store things high up overhead. So there's lots of precautions that are taken.
Well, I tell you, in terms of just reef keeping in general, I've always found over the years that it's really, really good to be prepared. I have not only one but two generators in case we lose the power here in Vermont. I mean, I don't have to worry about earthquakes or anything like that, but You know, we have a full house backup generator, and then I also have a portable generator in case that full backup generator does not work. And actually, I did have a full backup generator when we lived in Connecticut before Superstorm Sandy hit, and that generator did fail. So, you know, it's always good to kind of have redundancy and have some sort of plan in place. But I'm sure, like with a public aquarium, you guys really have to think about pretty much every possible scenario.
You know, and I have to say that actually the earthquake that I did experience was in Hawaii.
Oh.
In 2007, there was a big earthquake off the Big Island, and that tripped off one of the power plants in Honolulu. And the way that their system is designed, their electrical grid, is that if one plant goes down, they all go down as a safety precaution because they can't handle the load by themselves. And so it took them, we didn't have power for 14, 15 hours.
Oh,
And
wow.
because they then had to start one plant at a time very slowly and ramp up slowly, and everybody had to turn everything off. And so we were running off a backup generator that didn't have enough fuel, and we had to go to the had to drive to the fire station with the state truck and big drums and have them fill it up with fuel.
Ooh.
And then drive it back to the aquarium and hook that up to the generator.
Wow.
So that was my biggest experience with an earthquake. I wasn't in San Francisco, funny enough.
Well, again, knock on wood there. So, Charles, you mentioned some of the exhibits that you manage. What exhibits would you say are the toughest to manage at Steinhardt? Most challenging, perhaps.
Well, you know, they all have their challenges, you know, and they all have different challenges. Let's put it that way. Some it's keeping the animals healthy. In other cases, it's keeping the exhibit stocked. Some of the animals, for example, cephalopods have a limited lifespan, so you have to make sure you get a backup animal or you have access to a source. Some of those things are seasonal, so it's hard to get them. I think it's been challenging for us to maintain especially with COVID. You know, obviously there's no travel. And so our Twilight Zone exhibit is stocked mainly with animals that our rebreather diving team collects. And as a result, you know, they haven't been out in the field for over a year and a half collecting for the exhibit. So it's been challenging to keep those stocked. And also with just purchasing from wholesalers, it's been challenging because of the limited supply. But I would think, you know, the big reef tank obviously is probably the most challenging from my perspective because, as I said, you know, even bad things happen slowly, and it takes a lot to correct it. And the problem is there's so many different variables that can be a cause of that, and a lot of it's synergistic. You know, where there's a number of different things that are going on. So that's been you know, over the 12 years that I've been managing and working on that system, that's been by far the most challenging. We've had periods of ups and downs where everything's, you know, it's no different than a Homa tank, I think, for many people, is that things are just rocking along, everything's growing, doing well, and all of a sudden you start losing stuff, and you don't know why. You know, things start bleaching out, you start losing, you get RTN, you get parasite issues, things are just losing color or lightening up. I mean, it's just all kinds of weird stuff. And then, as we all do, I mean, you just basically just throw everything you can at it, and eventually it turns around. But then the problem is you don't really know what is it that you did that solved the problem.
Right, because you're trying multiple things at once.
Exactly.
So, Charles, is this a good time to play the slideshow, and maybe you can kind of talk about the big reef tank? Would this be an appropriate time to do that? So I'm starting to roll it. I'm starting to roll it. So you should probably see the first slide in about 15 seconds on YouTube there. And yeah, folks. So Charles is just going to kind of take us through a presentation of this is the large reef aquarium exhibit, I believe, right?
Yeah, most of it's on that. It's photos that we've taken. Some of them are about 3 years old, and most of them are in the we're taking this month. And a couple of pictures of our Twilight Zone exhibit, which features a pair of fish that we have that we collected ourselves. So basically, that's me, and all the photos in here are copyright, by the way, of California Academy of Sciences. And this is the shallow portions of our tank. This is a photo that was taken a couple of years ago with tridacna clams, anemones, heteractis, and techmea. This is some of the carpet anemones that we have. There's a blue carpet. We also have this next one is a sort of orangish, reddish carpet. It's kind of cool.
Beautiful.
We do have some clownfish in there, but not a lot. We want to get maybe some saddlebacks. They like to live in this type of anemone. We also are looking at putting an underwater camera in, and this is basically the location it would be in. So you can see the fish. The tank, the deepest is maybe about 2 feet. So we're looking at getting a new camera. This is our second smallest viewing window. We call this the Buddha window because it's kind of shaped like a Buddha's belly. This was taken about 3 years ago when things were really rocking in there. These are more recent photos just taken this month. And so there you can see the diver on the left and some of the acropora. So we lost a lot of our acropora, a lot of our Montipora since COVID, and things are coming back. The big coral you see in the middle there, that's a Hydnophora. That one has gone through a boom and bust. Right now it's in a boom phase. You can see it's overgrowing everything. Some of our acropora is starting to come back, bounce back, and color up again nicely. And there's a close-up of some of the branches of it coming up there. So really happy with that. That window basically features most of the acropora that we have on the exhibit, and that was by design. We wanted to light that area pretty heavily. The tank is lit with 76 1,000 watt metal halides.
Wow.
They're 10K and 14K. They're all Hamiltons. And we just in the midst of a bulb change out. We've got 2/3 of the bulbs changed out right now. We change them out every 6 to 8 months. We also have some LEDs that we're working with. We have a Kessel A2000 we're just trialing. But then we have some small eco-exotic cannons, the blues, just for effect, to give a little bit more punch to the tank, and also for evening events. So the lights, those lights stay on until about 10 or 11 o'clock, whereas the metal halides go off at by 6. A couple of big Sticklodactyla Hadnii anemones with paraperculas in there. Those were actually a donation from a hobbyist down in Monterey area. Again, this is still all the Buddha window. So these are corals that die back and now coming back again, especially the Turbinaria. And some of these leather corals are starting to open up again. And we're also getting a lot of recruitment of Poslepora damicornis. As most people know, it's a planilator. This is the main exhibit window tank photo I took a few years ago. All that coral on the right there, unfortunately, we lost that to brown jelly during COVID. But we're starting to put new pieces in there, and it's starting to grow back. This is another Hydnophora that's just under a walkway. It's about 2 feet of water. Some leather corals and some Montipora. Lots of urchins in there, lots of snails. So some of these, this is a coral that we've had since day one, so it's been in there for 13 years. It's Leptastria. Some blue Lynchia sea stars for, detritivores for cleaning up. So some of the larger polypstonies, LPS corals are doing pretty well. They seem to be the hardiest for us. The thick tissued ones seem to be the best in terms of survival. And this is now on the top edge of the main window. The whole tank is viewable from the top. So there's a walkway around it, some Turbinaria peltata, some small frags that are starting to grow and encrust again. So we have a lot of surface area. There's some blue coral, some Heliopora. There's a Rumphella soft coral. Sorry, it's a Gorgonian. Not a Rumphella. There's another Gorgonian. Some more Montipora that's growing out. So we've added some new pieces too that we've grown behind the scenes, and they're growing really well. They're showing growth edges. Same with this Montipora. There's some frags from ORA. Yeah. We bought from aquaculture pieces. Yeah. Same with this one, another Montipora. And Euphyllia is doing really well for us. We always had problems with Euphyllia, but we also had angelfish and some other fish in there that we since removed over the years. And this is one of the corals that's done really well. Some Lobophilia. These are all bouncing back after some of the events that we had over the last year. So the challenges we faced. Bubble corals are coming back again, looking really good. So it's a huge tank. There's a lot of surface area, so it's challenging when we lose a lot of coral. It really shows. But some stuff's growing. So this is up in the top left here. You see a patch of fire coral from August 2018, and this is what it looks like now. So it's completely covered that pinnacle. So we maintain it by, we have a bead of epoxy around the edges of it. So when it grows over that, we peel that back. We have fungia that's reproducing. So these are Acantha coli that are growing off the skeleton of a fungia. So those will break off and spread. Like I mentioned, the Possipora damicornis is just self-planulating and seeding all over the tank. We had that about 9 years ago. We had that, and then we had a big die-off where we lost most of it. This is a Favid coral. It's in August 2020, very lightened up. We didn't know what was wrong with it. We made some adjustments, and now it's growing, looking better again, less than a year later. So there's still a little bit of a lightness on there. Another thing that we've had some issues with is Montipora. So you see this Montipora capricornis. It got that brown in the middle, and it's just orange on the edges. And so these are colonies that were all orange, and then got that brown in the middle. And I've talked to other aquarists that have also exhibited that, and no one really has an explanation for it other than it might be lighting related. So I'd be interested to hear if anybody's got some thoughts on that. And then this is our one of our newer exhibits that opened in 2016. They call the Twilight Zone, which features fish and invertebrates that were collected from between 300 and 500 feet. And these are the crown jewels of that exhibit. It's a pair of peppermint angels that we've had for about almost 2 years now.
Do they, and I'm assuming they're pretty decent citizens in terms of not nipping at corals, or do they take a peck?
They're by themselves. There are no other fish with them.
Okay.
There are some, there's some stereonepthia, there's some scleronepthia, some dendronepthia in there with them. They seem to be okay with it. Sometimes a little bit of picking going on. So we're experimenting to see what, how well they do with those kinds of fish. But they're in a tank that's dedicated just to them. It's not very big. The fish are tiny. I mean, they came in, I think the smallest one was maybe an inch.
Oh, wow.
They were collected fairly small. Those were collected under permit by our deep diving team in Tahiti.
Yeah, you just don't really see those at all in the hobby anymore. I mean, it's very tough to get, and if you can get one, they're super expensive from what I understand.
The last one I saw offered was on Divers Den. I think they were asking $20,000 or $25,000 for it.
Wow. You got to know what you're doing if you're going to be plunking that kind of cash for a fish. That's for sure.
Yeah, like I said, we've had these now for, we had them in holding in Tahiti for almost 2 months. They were eating fine there, and we brought them back, and they're eating fine here as well. So, we feed them, frozen Hikari myces, live myces, copepods, live adult copepods. We don't clean the backdrops as much as we do in the other ones because a lot of little copepods, hapracticoid copepods, colonize that. We see them picking those things. So this tank is, like you might say, maybe it's a little dirty compared to some of the other exhibits, but we do that on purpose because we want to give them the widest choice of foods to feed off of.
So Charles, I got a bunch of questions, and I'm seeing some questions coming up here in the chat. And Alex Correa is asking, Charles, could you please let us know about the additives for such a huge tank? Do you use kalkwasser, calcium reactor? What are you guys using for calcium and alkalinity supplementation?
Great question, Alex. For people who don't know Alex was one of my volunteers at Waikiki Aquarium.
Oh.
So he's been volunteering at the Waikiki Aquarium for over 20 years, I believe.
Wow.
And he's a self-confessed coral nut. So anyway, living in Hawaii is challenging, as you can imagine. So Alex actually built his own rockwork, and he's collected his zoanthids, which are legal to collect in Hawaii, but you can't collect stony corals, can't collect live rock. So he's created his own exhibits, really quite nice. You should feature him sometime. It's pretty cool. Anyway, we don't use kalkwasser anymore. We use mainly calcium reactors. We found that the alkalinity was climbing a little bit too much with the kalkwasser, but now and then we'll play with it, add it back again. We do add manganese and iron. So we have an iron citrate and manganese sulfate, I believe it is, combination solution that we mix ourselves. We also add potassium iodide to the tank. We use activated carbon. We have been using lanthanum chloride to keep the phosphates low. By low, I mean around 0.06 to 0.1, in that range, 0.12. What we found, though, is that during COVID, everything got shut down. So we didn't have any visitors, and we didn't do any dive shows. And there was a number of feeds that occurred during the dive shows. And one of the things I found was that the phosphate levels started dropping lower than we normally would run them. And our nitrates run around 15 parts per million nitrate. And so our corals started to get lighter in color.
Even at 15 parts per million, they're getting light.
Yes, because the phosphate was dropping.
Oh.
So the phosphate was becoming the limiting nutrient. They had lots of nitrogen, but they couldn't suck up enough phosphate to use that nitrogen. So basically what we stopped doing is adding lanthanum chloride and slowly let the phosphate levels climb back up a little bit higher. We use GFO and 2 small reactors as well. And in the past, we've used Cooper's Orb. We don't add strontium because our mix, actually make our own saltwater mix. So we make our own salt mix. We add all the components and we mix it ourselves. And those components usually have some strontium as a contaminant, so to speak, in that. So we found through Triton testing and also testing through the San Francisco Public Works Department that our strontium was a little on the high side, so we stopped adding it to our mix. And that's pretty much all we add.
What kind of pH does that tank normally run at in terms of the range?
It runs around 8.2, 8.1 to 8.3 in that range. We actually, so because it's such a large system and there's such large pumps running it, we have what's called a degas tower. So think of it as a large giant trickle filter that has some media in it. And the idea there is the water from the sand filters and from the fractionators mix there, and they cascade down and they blow off any excess nitrogen gas, so we don't get any saturation issues. And the problem with that is that that's located in the same room as the fractionators, and so we get a lot of salt incrustation, salt in the air. So we've played around with covering that tower, the top of it, and letting some of the air out. And when we do that, the pH goes down. So we've taken the covers off a couple of 3 or 4 years ago, and of course our pH went up like 0.1, 0.2, and so it runs around there.
So that's why you guys are not don't need to be supplementing with the kalkwasser, is because the pH is already kind of like where.
Yeah, it's pretty much where we want it. Also, the kalkwasser has other benefits. It adds some alkalinity, but it also adds some calcium, and it also will precipitate some phosphate out. But really, right now we don't seem to need it.
How often are you guys doing like ICP tests on that tank? Is that something that you need to do like on a weekly basis, or do you not fret too much on that stuff?
Yeah, we don't worry too much about it. We usually test it when we start seeing issues. We've sent it out for ICP analysis, and not to disparage any of the companies doing that, but we've had instances where we've sent the same water sample from the same tank, taken at the same time to different companies and gotten back completely different results. So it's really, it's challenging to know what numbers to believe. So we have also for several years sent water to the San Francisco Water Department for them to analyze it. And we've also done some ICP analysis, mainly when we start seeing issues. But I think we would like to go to maybe doing it every month or so, just to see how things are tracking. And we also have our own water chemistry lab, but we're limited in terms of like what we can measure. And we can't measure iodide levels or some of these more esoteric things that ICP can tell you. But I have my own thoughts on the usefulness of ICP, but we'll save that for some other time.
Well, I was going to ask you that this is like up there, in terms of recent years with reef keeping, there's just so much information available to us hobbyists in terms of looking at the data and potentially making course corrections based on that data. And sometimes, the way I feel, it's almost like too much information at your disposal, and you're trying to get too fine, and you're trying to make too many changes at once. I almost
and I think there's also a term. I know I heard Rich Ross mention this on one of his Magna talk last year about confirmation bias, right? So you get a number, and you go, oh, that's a nice number. I like that number. So therefore you trust it. But when it's not the right number, then you're like, well, that can't be the right number. That's something wrong with the test, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's like you say, there's so much information, and it's the bottom line has always been for me is what are the animals telling you? What do you see? Do you see something different? Is the color changing? They're not opening as much? Are they not growing as quickly? Is the growth slowing? Are they losing tissue? I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you can, gauge how well a tank's doing. I've talked to, and Rich has talked about this in the past as well, written articles about it. And I talked with colleagues at the International Aquarium Conference a few years ago in Vancouver from Europe and other countries about phosphate and nitrate. What are they running their tanks at? And some of them are running their coral tanks at 2 parts per million phosphate, and not having seen any issues. And I wrote an article about that, and I think I had a presentation about it too. I've given in the past on that whole philosophy of sure, I mean, we can get some of these things to grow really well, but the real test is really, are they reproductive? Are they putting energy into making gametes and those kinds of things? To me, that's really, that's known as the fitness level of an organism. If it's fit, it's going to be putting energy into gametes, not just into growth. And do we really see that in some of these tanks? And now that people are becoming more aware of the possibility of sexually, spawning their corals in captivity, more people are starting to look at, gamete production by breaking off branches and seeing if there's eggs in there, that sort of thing. And I think that's a new direction that we're moving in that will inform us better about, are we giving them the right environment in terms of the nutrients and feeds and those kinds of things.
So you mentioned that, the tank there is generally at 15 part per million in terms of the nitrate and the phosphate, keep it in the 0.06 to 0.1 range. At one point in time, there was this whole movement in terms of these ultra low nutrient systems, and things have kind of moved away from that in terms of the hobby. But when you look at natural seawater and the level for nitrate at natural seawater levels is like a 0.01 or 0.02, something in that realm.
It's even lower than that. That's more zeros to that.
Add more zeros to that. So yeah. Why is it do you think it's best to not, or is it okay in certain circumstances to run a tank with those very low nitrate levels that mimic natural seawater, or is it a matter of having some sort of setup where it's high import, high export, and you're pulling out what you're putting in?
It's a very complicated puzzle, Keith, because there are so many variables in our little glass boxes that don't match what is in the ocean. And I've argued with people over the last over the decades basically about this is not the ocean. So if you're going to try to replicate one aspect of the ocean, well, what about all the others that you're not replicating? How is that? It's a balance. So if you look at a coral reef, sure, the levels that are in the water are low, but it doesn't mean that those corals aren't getting those nutrients from somewhere. The reason it's low is because they're sucking it up as fast as it's being produced.
Right.
So you have to have some kind of a nutrient input, and there's so many different ways that corals can absorb nutrients, either by ingesting them or by pinocytosis, by taking it from the water. There's just so many ways that they get this nutrition that they can use to grow and also to reproduce. That it's to replicate that in our tanks is challenging. And I think in the early days, I remember when we were doing volume 3, and looking at some people's tanks, and we have photos of some of these tanks in that book, where and I saw the tanks, and after leaving, I was talking to a friend of mine that when we were driving away, I said, those tanks, those corals really remind me of a bleached coral reef, because all these light pastel pinks and yellows and mauves are what you see on a bleached coral that's lost most of its zooxanthellae. And if you look at photos online of coral reefs that were bleached by Bruce Carlson, for example, it's exactly what those corals look like. And I remember when they had the big bleaching event in 1998 in Palau and Fiji, that global warming period that we had of global bleaching. They were selling corals at wholesalers as ultra this, ultra that, because they were all bleached out and they were bright yellow and purple and pink. It's, anyway, I think I'm getting off track here, but I think you can run an ultra low nutrient system, but you have to be producing nutrients for the coral. So ultra low nutrient doesn't mean that it's low nutrient for the animals. The water's low nutrient, but the animals are still trying to get that nutrition from somewhere. And you've got to provide it in whatever form that is. And I have a very close friend of mine who's the curator at the Burgers Ocean at the Burgers Zoo in Arnhem in the Netherlands. He manages a 180,000 gallon live coral tank, and he has to add he's adding sodium nitrate to the tank because he can't get his nitrate levels up because it gets sucked out so fast.
Yeah, that's actually been an issue with my 187 gallon tank. It's very SPS heavy dominant, and I'm currently dosing 2-part on that tank, and I'm switching over to a calcium reactor, but that tank just sucks up the nitrate and the phosphate to the point where I am dosing nitrate and phosphate. In fact, I stopped dosing nitrate a couple of weeks ago, and I had nitrate levels in the 2.5 to 5 part per million range, and my phosphate was in the 0.03 to 0.07 type of range. And when I stopped dosing, I just decided, all right, I'm going to start feeding more in terms of feeding the fish more heavily. That did not do it. I mean, my nitrates and phosphates just got down to close to zero. So I started back to dosing because I just couldn't keep up with it.
Yeah, and the other thing to remember is that most people are keeping their calcium and alkalinity and magnesium levels much higher than the ocean.
Right.
And that's driving calcification. And as a result of that, these corals are trying to grow. Their skeletons are growing, but the tissue has a hard time keeping up if they don't have enough nutrients. And so that's why you see, tissue loss, and you see, these bleaching corals or the white tips on the corals, is that they just can't generate the tissue at a rate to keep up with the skeletal growth. So if they're going to run ultra low nutrients, then the alkalinity should be a DKH of like 7 or 8 at the highest, and your calcium should be like maybe 410, 400.
So what do you guys do there at for the large reef tank in terms of feeding and additives? What trace elements? What do you do in terms of trying to keep the corals happy in terms of food and what have you?
Well, in terms of food, we add ROE, the fish egg supplements. We add Hikari myces. We add Piscean energetics myces. We add concentrated rotifers. We add, let's see, what else do we add? We add some oyster fees, some phytofeast. I mean, there's a mixture of things that we add. Shout out to Reed Mariculture, without whose support we would never be able to do this, because they're donating a lot of that to us.
Yeah, I'd say you guys probably need large quantities of that stuff, right?
Yeah, we've gone through different ways in terms of feeding the tank. At one point, we made a zone feeder, what we call our zone feed. So we have 5 huge return lines into the tank that go out in different places, and we cut into one of those, and we were injecting food and letting it blow all over the tank. But that was basically the shear forces, and they were so great. I mean, that's water coming from 3 40 horsepower pumps that's going through those lines for just recirculation. So they was breaking everything apart. So we started, and then we also had an auto feeder that we were dosing. Also live baby brine we dose. We feed that out every day, tons of it. And so we have auto dosers that are on peristaltic pumps that inject that food into different water streams, so it spreads around the tank, keep the anthias up swimming around. So we do a lot of those kinds of additions. And then in terms of main feeds, we feed chopped clam, chopped shrimp, chopped squid. We have gel diet that are herbivores. We put big heads of romaine lettuce in there on plastic chains that we had in there for the tangs.
Wow.
We had laver as well, the freeze dried seaweed, big huge sheets of it. So yeah, and I also just want to recognize like some of the people that have worked on this exhibit. It's not just me. We've had Rich Ross managing that tank for many years, Matt Wandell, a number of other people that are still there, Nick Yim, Alan Jan. We've got Lisa Larkin now is working with us. She's managing that exhibit from Long Beach Aquarium. We hired her back in July. Just a plethora of people, that have put a lot of heart and soul into that tank and agonized over that tank for many, many years. I mean, it was first animals went in there in January of 2008.
Wow. So I've got some more questions, but folks, I certainly encourage you to ask Charles some questions about the tank and about reef keeping in general in the chat. So you mentioned, Charles, that you have 76 1,000 watt metal halides on that exhibit.
Yeah.
What do you think the future holds? And I know this is probably a question Alex would like to chime in on in terms of the future of metal halides. How much longer do you think the technology will be available in terms of being able to find replacement bulbs? 5 years? That long?
Maybe 5, maybe 10. It's being left up to some of the independent companies to try and scrounge these bulbs together. Like, I know that one of the issues that we ran up to pretty quickly was Ushio stopped producing their 10,000K 1,000-watt metal halide. That hit a lot of us. Luckily, Hamilton's still supplying those. We would love to go over to LEDs, but there are a number of issues with LEDs for us because the sheer size of the units, for one,
Right.
and the weight. For us to support those on over the tank is going to be very challenging. They just don't have the punch of a metal halide yet. They're getting better. We've done a bunch of measurements, dry, through air, and looking at the Kessel, the max spec. They can get close to 1,000-watt metal halide depending on what reflector we use on the metal halide, whether it's a wide or a narrow or a medium reflector. But they drop off quickly on the sides. But the other biggest issue I think for us is we can't just swap out a bulb if they fail. We have to swap out the entire unit. So
Right.
I think for us, really, what we're really looking for are these module units where we can swap out a section of the LEDs instead of having to replace the entire fixture.
Right.
I think the real breakthrough is going to come when they can improve the electronics and the heat dissipation so that they don't have to be these huge, heavy, bulky things. That's really going to help. A friend of mine, again, the fellow that's in Holland, he's been trying out several LED lights and max spec included. And what he's found is that they do lose intensity over time. They don't maintain their intensity. So there is a drop off. What we don't know is, how great of a drop off is it? Does it continue to drop off or does it level off? With metal halides, you'll get an initial drop and then they level off pretty good, maintain their intensity for a pretty long time. The reason why we switch ours out after 6 or 8 months is because the mixture of rare earth elements that they put in these bulbs to get the spectrums that we need, the blue ones are quite unstable. So they're the ones that go first. And that's why you see these drops in the blue output. So it's interesting. The other thing I've heard from LED manufacturers is it's not intensity that's important, it's the spectrum. And that when we measure PAR out of LEDs against metal halides, it's not really it's apples and oranges because the LEDs are concentrating most of their energy into the blues and reds areas for photosynthesis, whereas the metal halides are covering a wider spectrum of light wavelengths. And so you're measuring, the PAR is measuring those where the LEDs don't have as much of that in their spectra. So, it's challenging.
Yeah, when I had Sanjay Yoshi on the show last November, he essentially said that he talked about the blue light versus the full spectrum just in LEDs, and he said that he runs his LEDs on full spectrum because he just feels like he's going to get much better growth with the full spectrum profile in LEDs versus a more blue profile, which is what a lot of people are running. And the reason being that there's when you're running those blue lights, you can really see the fluorescence of the corals pop. So that's kind of like been a change, I guess, versus when.
Right, and we have the I think it's the UPR Tech spectrometer that's available. It's a handheld unit, and when we do the spectrum on the LEDs and adjust the spectrum, the blue doesn't change at all. All that's being pumped up is the yellows and reds and oranges, and that's what we see the increase in the spectrum. The blues stay rock solid. That output doesn't change when you adjust it. All you're doing by changing the spectrum is dialing down the other colors.
Right.
So the amount of blue is there, which the corals need. And one of my concerns is we have tridacna clams, and we know that they love intensity. And so how well they're going to do under some of these metal halides remains to be seen. And I think, again, the problem is our tank at the deepest is 24 feet. And wow. You're not going to get, we get a PAR now with our metal halides of about 150 at the bottom. And I don't know that that LEDs can do that yet. They're just too big right now. And we've got a big giant unit that we got from Hubble Lighting. It's meant for stadiums. And the color temperature is only 5,000 Kelvin because that's for broadcast. So the industry, the market is so small for aquariums. For these big companies to then churn out a light that's say 10,000 Kelvin, I don't know that the incentive is there yet, because they're basically just looking at lighting stadiums and parking lots and warehouses, not aquariums.
So we have a couple of folks that are watching. Alex being one of them that are big metal halide fans. Chris Meckley, hey Chris, what's up, from ACI Aquaculture, is a big metal halide person. In fact, I believe he's hoarding metal halide bulbs to make sure that he's not left out in the cold when that dark day does happen, when you can't find him. But he highlights in his comment, you guys change out those bulbs every 6 to 8 months. Is that because they're being overdriven, or do you just feel, what kind of, I guess my question would be to you is, what kind of ballast are you running them on? Is it just a switchable electronic ballast?
So we have the original ballasts were, the magnetic ballast.
Okay.
Yeah, but we've now switched over, I would say, half of those lighting to a electronic ballast that's adjustable. So we can run them at 600, 750, 1,000, and 1,200 watts. So not all the bulbs are running at 1,000. Excuse me. Not all the bulbs are running at 1,000 watts. A lot of them are only running at 750. But what I do see is, like in our shallows area, those first pictures I showed, we just finished changing out the bulbs on those, and they're all running at 1,000 watts. And you can really see the difference. It's much brighter there now. And our Heteractis magnifica are just twice the size they were before. So for me, it's a drop in intensity, but it's also a shift in spectrum. What I'd love to be able to do is to, every month to go in there and measure that spectrum and measure the intensity. Now we have that spectrometer, we could probably do that and see how much it really is changing. But because, some of those bulbs are trying to punch down through 24 feet of water, it doesn't take much of a drop in intensity to really be noticeable at the bottom.
Yeah, Alex is saying that Hamilton has no plans to stop production. Radium is also on and has no plans to stop production. I'm a big fan of the 400 watt 20K radium bulbs. I've been using those for years and years and years. And
yeah, I used those 1995, Waikiki.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what? There's nothing better in terms of that look on the metal halide bulb. I use the metal halides and the T5 combination, but I started a new 225-gallon Peninsula tank, and this is the first time in my nearly 30 years in reef keeping that I'm using LEDs, and so far so good. I've got a lot of LEDs over the tank, but the tank is also only 20 inches tall. So
yeah, that makes a big difference. I think there's no doubt that you can grow corals under LEDs. It's what you're looking for. What effect are you looking for? What's your main goal in keeping that tank, and will the LEDs meet that or not? The other thing that I found with some of the LED manufacturers, because of the density of the LED matrix, the glitter lines are just insane. And for some of our tanks, we've got surface agitation. It's like a strobe is on the tank.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And for animal, well, it is, but for animal health and welfare, we have concerns, especially with cephalopods because of their eyes. They see as well as we do. Is it stressing them out? Is it affecting them? I think the jury's still out on that. Whereas with metal halides, you can, the glitter lines are there, but they're nowhere near as intense as they have, or some of the metal halide manufacturers, the way that they're making those, the LED manufacturers, the way that the LEDs are arranged, they're very closely packed together, and that really makes these really intense glitter lines, which you can kind of, with a diffuser, you can knock that back a bit. But it's something that my boss has pointed out several times as a concern.
Right. I don't even know how you guys would manage that switch at this point in time. It seems like it would be daunting in terms of trying to do that. I mean, how would you manage a transition from metal halides to LEDs? I mean, would it just really have to do a serious ramp down and then ramp up slowly in terms of acclimation?
Yeah, I have no idea. I know. I mean, we run LEDs on a lot of our small tanks. Very few of our smaller tanks, and when I say small, I'm saying from 10,000 gallons down to like I said, 5 or 8 gallons. A lot of those are now on LEDs. All our Twilight Zone tanks are on LEDs, but I did put have the biologist put translucent material on the tank covers because you don't get glitter lines at 400 feet, right? So I don't want that, and they don't need to be that bright. We are using radions because I like the fact that they have a diffuser. And we also have Kessels on a lot of our, those are the two main ones that we're being using right now. We do have a couple of max specs on a 4,000 gallon Caribbean live coral exhibit. We're transitioning that to a shallow mesophotic exhibit to highlight coral from Curacao that one of our researchers is working on, from 150 to like 200 feet. That range is what that habitat is ultimately going to be. So we like the fact that with the LEDs, we could tune it to make it a little bit bluer. But so far, the Gorgonians in there are still doing fine. We do have, I think, one metal halide still on the tank. So yeah, it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. But I know when I was in Vancouver again at the International Aquarium Congress, which I think was about 4 years ago, we had a roundtable discussion with other public aquarium people that had large coral tanks, talking about the scarcity in the metal halides and what are we going to do about it. And everyone was still kind of scratching their heads on, how are we going to handle this? And everyone's asking, well, where did you get your bulbs? And who's got bulbs? And,
yeah. Ask Chris Meckley from ACI Aquaculture. He can get.
Okay, Chris.
He can get.
Send me an email.
He's got a big stash of them someplace. So you mentioned something, Charles. I wanted to pivot a little bit here and go back to calcium and alkalinity supplementation, and you guys
Sure.
using calcium reactor for that without Kalkwasser. I've heard both things in terms of whether a second chamber in a calcium reactor is effective in terms of helping to absorb the excess CO2. What are your thoughts in terms of having that second chamber in a calcium reactor? Will it help lower the pH enough to make it worthwhile to have a second chamber, or do you think it just doesn't make too much of a difference at this point?
That's an interesting question, Keith. That's been around. Those double chamber things have been around since, I want to say the late 80s, early 90s, maybe mid 90s. I think it was
Marine Technical Concepts.
MTC that came up with that.
I still have that one.
Yeah, they came up with that whole thing. I don't know. I think it's a nice way to use up all your CO2 and make sure you're getting enough, but I don't know too many tanks that are suffering. And when it comes to calcium and alkalinity, that you need to have two chambers. I think the pH, the acidic nature of the water when it comes out is also good to make sure that the pH doesn't climb too high, because you can get those issues, especially if you're using Kalkwasser. As we all know, especially with a tank that's very densely populated with corals and other photosynthetic organisms, that the pH is going to climb during the day. To the point where I remember Alf Nielsen actually had, a CO2 controller where he was bubbling in CO2 to try and keep the pH below 8.4 because it was going too high. On our tank, it's interesting. When I was originally hired as a consultant before the academy opened, so I worked for 2 years on the design of that system, and then ended up working there a few years later. So they originally spec'd out 6 Shuran calcium reactors from Germany. And we had nothing but issues with those things, unfortunately. So we actually ended up taking them offline. And for, I think, about 3 years, we never had a calcium or alkalinity issue. It was always high. And the Georgia Aquarium, who preceded us by a couple of years in opening their big coral tank, they ran into a wall after about 2.5 years, where all of a sudden the calcium alkalinity plummeted. And the major difference between their exhibit and ours is that all their support structure for their rock and everything was fiberglass. And all of ours is concrete. So all ours is backfilled cinder block concrete with a concrete skin that's textured on top. So our concrete tank was leaching out calcium and alkalinity on its own. So we didn't need calcium reactors. So at this point right now, we have 2 calcium reactors that were originally built for a tank that was 20,000 gallons that has no problem maintaining the calcium alkalinity in that big reef tank, mainly because the sheer amount of concrete that's in there.
Well, that's a good tip. If anybody wants to avoid having to get a calcium reactor or dose 2 parts, just make sure you have a lot of concrete in your tank in terms of the base of the structure.
So we don't have an issue with the pH climbing too high or getting too low because of the excess CO2. I think our effluent from the 2 reactors, one reactor is right now running at a set point of 7.0, the other one's at 6.7. And so our combined effluent is like 6.8.
If you had to recommend to a hobbyist that is trying to get to the next level in terms of keeping a reef tank, in terms of nutrient control, right? In terms of nitrates and phosphates. You mentioned that you guys have used GFO, and but another way to go is to use macro, like in a refugium or an algae reactor or turf scrubber. What would you what's your preference in terms of a home aquarium in terms of the nutrient control? Do you think it's okay to use the GFO release for the phosphates and a protein skimmer to for nitrates and phosphates, or do you think it's also a good option in terms of using macro?
I think there are many roads to success, and I think that you can do both of those things. I think they both have pros and they both have cons. On the on the mechanical side of everything, I would say the pros are you have a little bit more control over it. So you can adjust how much GFO you put in there. You monitor the phosphate levels, make sure they don't go too low or go too high. There's issues with alkalinity. You can get depressed alkalinity when you use a lot of GFO. I think that with macroalgae, the danger there is that you can, if you let it go unchecked, it could quickly strip out everything out of the water. And, that was an issue many, many years ago. Some people might remember the Walter 80 algae scrubber, debate back in the early 90s when they're talking about their Smithsonian exhibit. And one of the problems that tank had was their algae scrubbers were too efficient. And they weren't, you have to be able to size them properly. What they were finding was that corals were losing tissue. They weren't doing well. But when they moved them off exhibit and started actually actively target feeding them, they started to regrow tissue. And one of the theories that they had was that the algae scrubbers were too efficient. And so the corals weren't getting enough, basic nitrogen and phosphorus to be able to, grow tissue. So I think there's a danger with that. The algae also releases a lot of exudates, which can affect watercolor. And there's also benefits. There's a lot of people who believe that they release things that are beneficial. So, I don't think there's a cut and dried answer, unfortunately, to that question, Keith. I think many approaches work, and a lot of people like to combine different approaches. We actually have, like our Twilight Zone tanks, we do have big containers of GFO and carbon, but we also have, we're going to start a ketomorph filter on a 2,000-gallon tank system that we have with gorgonians and things like that to try and see if we can manage the phosphate levels with that.
What would be like the minimum amount of light in terms of the hours of light, over ketomorpha? Let's say, I have an algae reactor going on one of my tanks right now, and I've got that on 5 hours of light opposite the display tank lights right now because my nitrates and phosphates are very low, and I think it is pulling out a lot. So I'm just trying to minimize the amount of time that the LEDs are on in that algae scrubber. I even know another successful reef keeper who has a refugium that turns the lights off for several days during the week, and the Chaeto still stays alive. What are your thoughts on that in terms of really dialing down that light cycle, or even going black for a couple of days during the week to kind of try to manage, the amount that ketomorph is pulling out?
Yeah, I think that's fine because, like I say, you need to be able to control it, and that's why that's one of the disadvantages of the algae. You need to know because first of all it's growing, so as it gets bigger, its nutrient uptake capability is going to increase exponentially. So you need to be able to adjust things. Now, the other thing you can do is photo period is one way. The other way is intensity. So with the LEDs, you can turn down the intensity. So it's like a volume button. You turn down the volume, they're not going to suck up as many nutrients as quickly and not photosynthesize to the same degree. There is, I forget what the term is, but there is a photosynthetic maximum that they reach, above which, no matter how much more light you give them, they're not going to photosynthesize. But you could probably find that out for ketomorpha, what it would be. You just have to do some online research for that. But there's also then a lower limit. How little light do they need to still photosynthesize?
Right.
And is there an exponential growth in photosynthetic capability with increase in light intensity? But I think it's, again, it goes to what's working for you and
Right.
and what are the animals telling you?
Right. Just firsthand experience to see what's happening with the tank.
Yeah.
We've had a couple of questions about pests and managing pests. How do you guys manage pests in your large systems or even the smaller systems? And one specific question was aqua-eating flatworms. You've got eggs that can be very
Right.
tough to eradicate.
Well, of course, the stock answer is don't introduce them in the first place,
Yeah.
right? So that's like quarantine your pieces and hold them separate from your main system so you don't get them in there in the first place. So we dip everything that we get in Revive or what's it, Reef Primer, are two good products that we've used with good success. But they don't affect the eggs, so we have to visually inspect. Or we break them off the substrate that they're coming in and only introduce the coral itself. I know that early on we were battling the cropper-eating flatworms in our big reef. Somehow they got in there, and we would just go into the garden hose. We just take a page out of Joe Iula's book, went in there with a garden hose, and just sprayed them down with dechlor water, and
really?
it knocks them off. Yeah, it knocks them off the branches, and the fish come and eat them all.
Right.
So once they're off the coral, the fish will eat them. And then I mentioned we had some issues. So during COVID, we sort of basically had a perfect storm. So we started a project where the dive deck, so all our access to the tank is through this deck that goes one side of the tank. That deck had some issues with water getting through the drains and leaking into the concrete below and spalling the rebar. So they decided to rip all that up, and they built these walls, which limited our access to it. And that was all starting up. They dug it all out, and then COVID hit in March of 20. Where are we now?
2020.
Yeah, 2020. So we really had limited access. We also did a big light change in January, and just after that, we started losing all our Echinopora to Paramecia. So basically, not Paramecium, but the Helicostoma. So that brown jelly protozoans. And we actually had to pull it all out, and we just were losing it all. So we took out sheets and sheets of it and lost most of that. Interestingly enough, it didn't affect Euophilia, which is one of the ones that usually hits pretty hard.
Yeah.
Then we found that we were losing our Montipora, and we found Montipora eating flatworms on there. So I've gone back and I knew that in Hawaii there's the belted wrasse, Thalassoma duprei, which feeds on Fistella nudibranchs that feed on Porites coral. And they've used those in the past to control them in aquaculture situations and research situations. So I went online and looked, what's the closest living relative to that species? Because we couldn't really put it in our tank because it's endemic to Hawaii. And our tank is supposed to represent the Philippines. And it's a different nudibranch that eats anyway. So I put in, let's see, the canary wrasse. And, Thalassoma, which is it again? I forget. It's the banana wrasse. So we put in a bunch of those, and they may or may not be helping. I don't know. But we don't seem to have as much problem with the Montipora anymore, mainly because most of it died off. I mean, the more pieces that we put in are growing again without too much issue. We've got 8, I think 7 of them in there, and one of them has turned into a super male. That's kind of cool. We also had issues with reef spiders, sea spiders. Big bad infection of those. We had those actually in a separate system that have just multiplied, where we'd have to be dipping them in reef primer, and we'd be getting hundreds off the corals. And we found them in the main reef. So we're looking at adding more wrasses to help control those as well. Our diversity has dropped. We haven't added new fish to that tank in probably 2 years. So it's time to start adding a few more fish again, getting our numbers up, particularly in fish that are useful. So we do have 6-line wrasse in there. We have Melanurus wrasses, but maybe just not enough. We don't have any leopard wrasses anymore. I want to get some more of those.
I love leopard wrasses.
Get some more Halicaris, that genus. Get some more of those in there. So yeah, that's basically what we do. And there are smaller tanks we use. Shrimp, the word mani for Aptasia. We use butterfly fish a lot in some of the smaller tanks for Aptasia control. And then we manually inject, with calcium hydroxide or calcium chloride or hydrochloric acid. Yeah.
So let me thank Great Bearded Reef Paul for the super chat. The comment is great guest knocking out for the night. Looking forward to rewatching this in the morning. Thanks again. So speaking of pests, let me ask you in terms of problematic algae, how do you guys deal with like cyano or bryopsis or dinoflagellates? Do you still try to stick with natural means of eradication, or do you use chemicals, ChemiClean to get rid of cyano? What are your thoughts on that? What do you guys typically do?
Well, cyano hasn't been very much of an issue in the smaller tanks. There it's just maintenance, and it's mainly, I had a biologist who's got some of my exhibits and that he's managing, and we had some cyano issues in the tank, and he just basically started basting the rocks with a turkey baster every couple of days and getting out the detritus and cleaning all the detritus out, and now he doesn't have any more cyano. So it's some of the systems are old, they got a lot of detritus in them, they need to be basically stormed up and get that out. Bryopsis, we don't have bryopsis issues. The only real issue that we have with bryopsis is in one system. That's a research system for a coral spawning lab. And so that's been manual removal. We've tried rabbitfish. I think right now we've gone through 4 different species. Siganus doliatus seems to be the one that seems the most effective, but again, you could probably get 10 of those of that species, and maybe 3 of them might eat bryopsis. We've tried emerald crabs. We've tried all kinds of things. The only thing we haven't tried yet is fluconazole as a chemical treatment. Yeah. But it's a research system, so there's a lot of hesitancy by the researcher that runs that system of using any kind of chemicals. I will say that in the big reef tank, we had an outbreak of like a cyanobacteria type that started growing and covering the rocks. And we were in there trying to manually siphon it out, and it was just too much. And I actually sent some off to a researcher, colleague of mine at the University of Hawaii, and they identified it as a type of cyano that thrives on iron. And they find it around iron shipwrecks. So I had our water tested for iron, and it was 0.2 parts per million iron. Normally, you want iron like 0.01 or less. And so just on a hunch, I said, can you filter that? Submicron filter the water sample and test it again, which they did, and it came back to 0.01. And so what was happening was at that time, we had 2 large canister filters. And by large, I mean they were probably 6 feet tall and 2.5 feet wide with GFO in them. And what was happening was because of the movement of the GFO in those reactors, we probably, in hindsight, we made them too wide. And so they didn't flow well, and there was a lot of grinding going on. And you could tell because the sock filters on the outlet were bright orange. And so the fines were getting into the tank and coating the substrate. And this is what the cyano was using. So we decided to try ChemiClean. So we worked with Jeff Turner, and he gave us a good deal because we needed a lot of it.
I bet.
And we turned, I think it was almost over $2,000 treatment, if I remember correctly. And this was maybe, I want to say it was maybe 7 years ago. I'd have to look. I think it was 2014. Turned off all the lights for 3 days, turned off the ozone for 3 days, and we dosed the whole tank. And it got rid of it. We had a few coral losses. We had a few losses that we couldn't really, pin on anything in particular. But since then, knock on wood, we have not had it.
Is a concern that when you add a chemical like that's knocking out a certain type of bacteria, that you're going to upset the balance of the good bacteria that you want to keep established? That's
one of it. That's one of it. And also, we're managed by an animal health department. And they're not going to let us put stuff in a tank unless they know what's in it. Right. So that's another, obstacle to using some of these products. You need to know what's in them. And then that's the other concern is and there's so much research coming out now. I just saw a paper on, there's a bacteria that live within zooxanthellae. And so if you're using antibiotics or whatever, are you affecting those bacteria that are in the zooxanthellae, and how does that affect coral bleaching and the susceptibility to bleaching? Because there's some evidence to suggest that these bacteria, are releasing vitamins to the zooxanthellae.
There's so many variables. So many variables.
There's so much we don't know, Keith.
Yeah,
That's the
I
bottom.
guess so.
There's so much we don't know.
Charles, I want to be respectful of your time. There's a couple of questions that I want to throw
Sure.
your way.
How about another 15 minutes?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
I want to thank Don Howard for the super chat. He's got a couple of questions. Question number one is, do you have any luck with the marginalis butterflies eating pests?
Marginalis butterflies.
I don't know if I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah, I just trying to figure out which one that is. Let me just Google it here real quick. My memory's not. Oh, yeah, I've never had them.
Okay, and
never had them. We were looking at getting them, but because I think these ones are also in cooler water, and we were looking at them for control in some of our temperate tanks. But no, we've never tried the marginalis. I think we may have had one at one time, but not in the big tank. We do have copper bands in there, and the copper bands are pretty good for us. We've had we've had butterflies in the reef tank in the past. The problem is that they eventually go up. Yeah, but and also Mahanos. Mahano anemones have been a problem. Ever since we used to have like a blue face, a Imperator angel, we had regal angels, all kinds of stuff. We didn't have much of a problem. Since we moved all those fish, the Mahanos have kind of taken over a little bit. So we've been having to nuke those. So we've had, in other tanks, we've had double saddles. We've had raccoons. Raccoons are great. But the problem is that some of these tanks, they'll pick at other corals, of course.
Right.
And in our ray lagoon, some of those butterflies like to pick at the eyes of the rays.
Ooh.
So the copper bands are usually the ones that we turn to the most.
Gotcha. So Don's other question is, this is getting to substrate, which we haven't talked about yet. What are your thoughts on miracle mud?
It's a miracle. It's a miracle that it works. No, I don't have no thoughts on it because I've never used it. And to be fair, Lang's a good friend of mine. And so I know people that swear by it. I know people that swear at it. So I really have no comment on it because I've never used it. I've never run a system with it.
So, okay, now that we're talking about substrate, what are your thoughts in terms of bare bottom versus a sand in a reef tank?
Well, it's the wheel of change, right? What's old is new again, and what is new is old again, right? So we started off with bare bottoms, and everybody wanted to have carpets of brilliant green star polyp coating the bottom of their tanks because it looks so cool.
Green star polyp
waving in the current, like a lawn. And then we went to the extreme opposite where people were putting 12 inches of sand in and having deep sand beds and people swearing by that. And, and then we've had plenums. I did run a couple of plenum systems at Waikiki, and for what I could tell, they worked fine, but I didn't have them for like 8 years. I had them for Bruce Carlson and I set up a tank for him down on the exhibit floor, and we ran that for maybe 4 years, 5 years, maybe 6. And that's maybe 5 years. And then that's the one where we had a drain in the bottom, and I could take water from the bottom. And it's in volume 3. I think the graphs are in there showing what we found. And we always had very low nitrate and phosphate in there. It worked great, as far as I could tell. But again, it's what floats your boat, and what makes the most sense. I mean, I know the people that use bare bottoms because they want ultra low nutrients. I mean, there's something to be said. If you're going to have a substrate, some people want to maintain it. All our tanks have substrates in them. We've had ones that have solidified and had to be taken out and removed and redone. We've had other ones that we just actively manage it by lightly, siphoning out detritus or having animals in there to, suspend that detritus. The reef tank has sand in it, and this mixture of sand and crushed coral. In the shallow area, we're actually in the process of removing a lot of the crushed coral and putting more coral sand. And I have an area with garden eels in the big tank that was 4 feet deep. And when we started filling that system in, we just said we can't put 4 feet of sand in there. So we added a bunch of large boulders that we had of coral rock. We put screening over that. We had to crush coral. We put another layer of screening. Then we put maybe a foot of sand at most for the garden eels. And over time, I'm sure that sand has worked its way through. So who knows what kind of, wonderful, crazy chemistry is going down in these dank, dark areas.
Right.
I have no idea.
Giancarlo Francisco, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that first name. How does sand versus bare bottom tie into biodiversity, both macro and microorganisms? So maybe the question is, there's been such a big, most people today start tanks with dry rock, right? And
Right.
there's no biodiversity with dry rock, so you have to kind of add in that biodiversity. And a lot of people also do bare bottom. So how do you get that necessary biodiversity if you're doing a dry rock only tank with bare bottom? I mean, that's a challenge.
Challenging.
It's a challenge that people have.
It's challenging. I mean, you have to buy those kits, right, of amphipods and things like that. And the advantage of that, the plus, looking on the bright side of it, is you can control what's going in there. So you have some control over the organisms that you're adding. And whereas when you had live rock, you didn't know what you were getting.
Right.
You were getting all kinds of stuff that some of it was good and some maybe it wasn't so good. But I remember, Walter Ady used to always champion his algae scrubber systems as being so diverse, and being able to measure the diversity of these microorganisms in his systems and how it was so fantastic. And I said, well, the hobbyist systems might be just as diverse. We don't know because we don't have the resources of the Smithsonian Institution to analyze our systems to find out what's in there. But I'm sure it's lower than some of these systems, and definitely by having a sand bottom, there are animals that live in those habitats only. You're not going to find them in bare bottom tanks because they spend the majority of their life in these sandy areas. So I think that there's something to be said from that. And also with the plenum idea, when Joubert floated that, his whole thing was seeding those gravel beds with certain microorganisms and macroorganisms that help to maintain those beds and keep them from clogging up with detritus. To keep them functional, keeping the water be able to move through those, the porosity up. So, there's, and then I guess the bottom line question is, how much biodiversity do we need in how much microorganisms do we need to create a stable ecosystem? Let's face it, these are ecosystems that we are managing.
Right. Yes.
Whether we know it or not,
yes.
We're actively managing these systems and making changes. And it's not a system that's just functioning on its own. We are making changes and having a direct input on it.
One more question I had about Substrate. Do you actively siphon your sand beds, or do you just have a cleanup crew that does the yeoman share of that kind of work?
We do a bit of both.
Okay.
Do a bit of both. Yeah, we do a bit of both. In some systems, we don't have much cleanup crew in there, so the biologists will be actively siphoning. But and when I had some smaller systems, when I first started there, I had a number of smaller tanks, and I used to turn over that bottom, and the amount of detritus that would come out of there was pretty astounding, and definitely would help with maintaining a better water quality by getting a lot of that detritus out of there. And as I mentioned earlier, with cyanobacteria, that detritus is a sink for phosphate. And a lot of times that cyano is growing on the bottom because it's basically liberating that phosphate out of the interstitial water and chemically liberating it from the detritus. They have enzymes that are designed to dissolve calcareous substrates to liberate the nutrients out of them.
Gotcha. So Charles, I think we're gonna wrap it up. My last question to you is there a plan for Reef Aquarium Volume 4 out there, or is it 3 volumes and that's what we got, or are you possibly working on something else in terms of a new book?
I've got a project that I told Julian I wanted to do many years ago that I'd like to do. The problem with books nowadays is that it's a lot of work to do it, and I'm not trying to say that I'm trying to get rich off of this, but I do want to get some reward for my effort. And unfortunately, books just don't sell as much or at all. And a lot of, I know I know Tony Vargas is coming out with a second volume, but I don't know what kind of volume he's, size he's printing, whether he's printing 1,000 books or 7,000 or whatever it is. But to print small numbers of books is extremely expensive. And you have to print large numbers to get a break on the pricing, and then you have to store those books till you can sell them. So it's a risky proposition now for publishers. Unless you're J.K. Rowling, you can't guarantee your books are going to sell. And my other pet peeve is, I can download all my books as PDFs. People just copy them and put them on the internet and share them amongst themselves. And there's even websites. There's a website, a guy in, I think he's in Georgia or South Carolina, has a website. All our books are like, our chapters are as if he wrote them verbatim with the photos, everything, just on his website.
Yeah.
So, it's just discouraging. Yeah. Why would I want to put all that work into it and then just to have somebody take it and put it on a website and call it their own? Yeah. Because let's face it, no one's going to sue anybody, and it's just not worth it. So they know that. And, but I'd love to do another book. I do have an idea for a book. I don't know that Julian's keen on doing another book. He's told me that if you want to write another book, go ahead. But I don't think he's keen on doing it. For him, it's a business decision. It's just an understandable one. It's hard to sell books now in the hobby. Most people are getting all their information online now.
Well, I'll tell you, your books, the 3 volumes were just invaluable for me in terms of when I got started in the hobby and just kind of brushing up every now and then on them. It's just great information, and like I said at the beginning of the show, I highly recommend anybody that hasn't picked up those books to try to find a copy if they can of those that series. Just
a lot of libraries have it too.
Oh, okay.
And you can find it on book resellers and places like that. But the whole goal of writing those books was to disseminate that information. And when I first conceived of writing the book, my concern was the few books that were out there that were in English were horrible. And some of them were just thinly disguised advertisement for a company's products. And it was controlled by a very small publishing group. And so when Julian partnered up with Two Little Fishies with his partner, who was a graphic designer for books, we said, hey, how about we do a book together? And he has just to first of all, to counteract a lot of the misinformation that was coming out in some of these other books, and to put something out of quality that was unbiased. We weren't trying to sell a product to anybody. And coming at that time, I was just finishing off my master's in zoology. And so I was of a scientific mind in terms of finding references and not just spouting stuff out, but actually backing it up with scientific references. So that was really the germ of the idea. And then when we started writing it, it became apparent that it was going to be a huge book, and it'd be so expensive that nobody would want to buy it. So we made the decision to split it into 2 volumes. And that's why there's a volume 1 and 2. And then, it took many years to go then do to volume 3. Right. And that one took a year and a half of just research and talking to people and researching literature to come up with that book. The technology's changed a lot, but a lot of it's still the same. And even the first book, it was published in 1994. The biology doesn't change a lot. There's new discoveries, but the basics are still the same.
Same principles.
Yeah.
Yep.
Same principles.
So Charles,
well, thanks for those kind words.
Yeah. So Charles, any final thoughts before we wrap it up?
Just like to thank everybody, and again, Marine Depot for sponsoring this, and my support team at the Academy. Again, all the members of the Coral Reef team that help manage that exhibit. It's a Herculean task, to say the least. And all the people that have worked on that in the past, like Rich Ross and Matt Wandell. Again, that tank wouldn't be the way it is today without the input that those guys put into it. And it was just a pleasure being here today and chatting with you, Keith. And again, if there's any other questions that you want to forward to me later, I'm happy to answer those as well. Except for Alex. Alex always asks me questions. He doesn't get to answer anymore.
He's got a direct pipeline to you, I guess.
He does.
So, Charles, listen, I really, again, appreciate you taking the time to be a guest. Would love to have you on again in the future at some point down the road. I know I got a lot of additional questions to ask you, but we're going to let you go tonight. So that'll do it for this show, folks. Again, thank you, Charles, for being a guest. I also want to thank our sponsor, Marine Depot, for supporting the show, and also to all of you folks out there watching. I really, really appreciate tuning in and every week. So my next live stream is not going to be until Thursday, May 6th at 7 p.m. And I got David Hammondtree scheduled to be on the show, who's the president and CEO of Reef to Reef. So that should be another great show. Anyway, until then, be safe out there, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming. See you later. Hopefully soon in person at a Mac.